The wind howled like a wounded animal across the open plains. Rain came down in sheets, blurring the line between earth and sky as thunder cracked through the black Montana night. James Callahan stood alone on the porch of his weather-beaten ranch house, his hand resting on the stock of an old shotgun he hadn't touched in years. He didn't flinch when lightning forked overhead. Didn't blink. Just stared into the storm, where someone, was moving. A shadow stumbled down the gravel road, weaving like a drunk, arms limp at her sides. James narrowed his eyes, heart ticking slow but hard. Most folks knew better than to wander up this far, especially during a storm like this. But the figure kept coming, collapsing just beyond the gate. For a second, she didn't move. Then she lifted her head. Even through the rain, he could see her eyes, wide, terrified, and too young to be out here alone. He didn't want to move. Didn't want to open that gate, let alone the door to the world he'd shut out years ago. But something ancient stirred in his chest. A voice that sounded like his wife's before the fire took her. Before his son. Before everything. One step, it whispered. Just one step. He took it. The girl was soaked to the bone, shivering in torn jeans and a sweatshirt 2 sizes too big. Blood seeped from a gash on her leg. Her left eye was swollen shut. No shoes. No name. Just fear wrapped in flesh. She tried to crawl away when he reached her. Easy, James said, kneeling down. Ain't gonna hurt you. Her breath came in frantic bursts, but she stopped moving. He carried her inside, careful not to jostle the wound. Briggs, his old cattle dog, barked once and then backed away, tail between his legs. Even the dog could feel the weight she brought with her. Inside, the house was cold and sparse, shadows clinging to the corners. A broken clock ticked even though it hadn't worked in years. James laid her on the old couch by the fireplace and wrapped her in a quilt that still smelled faintly of lavender and dust. The fire caught slow but steady. He cleaned the cut on her leg, biting back a curse at how deep it went. She didn't make a sound, just clenched her jaw and stared at the ceiling like pain was a familiar guest. When he tried to ask her name, she turned her face to the wall. He didn't push. Just stitched her up, fed her broth, and left a bucket near the couch in case she threw up. In the quiet that followed, he found himself watching her. She was maybe 15. No bruises fresh enough to bleed, but enough old ones to write a story. Someone had hurt her. Bad. And not just once. She slept like someone who didn't expect to stay alive until morning. Her hands stayed curled into fists. Her back never relaxed. James sat in his recliner, the fire crackling between them, and wondered if he was insane. Bringing a strange girl into his home. The world was a dark place, he knew that better than most. But so was solitude. He hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to anyone in months. The ranch had become his graveyard. A place where echoes lived longer than people. In the middle of the night, he woke to a sound that turned his blood to ice. A scream, not loud, but strangled, full of terror and something even worse. Surrender. James stood instantly. The girl was thrashing on the couch, eyes shut tight, breath short and panicked. No, please, don't, I said I'd be good. He crossed the room in 3 strides and gently gripped her shoulder. Wake up, he said, voice low. You're safe. You're safe here. She jerked upright, gasping. Her eyes searched the room like a caged animal. When they landed on him, she recoiled. James took a step back, hands up. Just a nightmare, he said. No one's gonna touch you here. She didn't reply. just stared at him, then down at the floor, then back at the fire. After a moment, she pulled the quilt tighter around herself and lay back down, facing away from him. James sat back in his chair. The fire was dying, but he didn't move to feed it. By morning, the rain had stopped. Mist hung low over the fields like the land itself was holding its breath. The girl was still asleep, face tucked into the crook of the couch. James made coffee, fried 2 eggs, and put a plate on the table across from her. She didn't touch it. Didn't speak. Just sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the steam curling from the cup. He tried again. "You got a name?" She looked up, just for a second. "No." It was the first word she'd spoken. 1 syllable. Flat. Final. James nodded, accepting the wall she'd put up. He wasn't about to tear it down. He knew too well what people looked like when everything had been taken from them. He went outside, fed the horses, checked the fence line, let the cold bite his skin the way guilt never could. When he came back inside, the couch was empty. For one awful second, he thought she'd vanished into the fog. Then he heard a creak from the hallway. She was in his son's room. He didn't move. Didn't speak. Just watched through the half-open door as she stood in the center of that dust-covered space, running her fingers over the cracked wooden frame of an old photograph. James closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, the weight of silence didn't feel so heavy. It started with the truck. Dust kicked up in slow spirals behind the rust-colored Chevy as it crawled past the ranch, the driver pretending not to look. James saw it from the hayloft, one hand on a pitchfork, sweat stinging his eyes. The truck didn't stop. Just rolled by, too slow for a stranger, too familiar for coincidence. Ellie saw it too. She was brushing Sparrow in the paddock, her eyes narrowing, body freezing the way prey does when it senses the hunter. "They found me," she said. James climbed down without answering. He didn't need to ask how she knew. You didn't forget the scent of danger once you'd lived in its mouth. That night, James locked every door. Every window. He dug out his father's old Remington from the gun cabinet he hadn't opened in years. Cleaned it by lantern light, hands steady but heart tight. He hadn't fired a weapon since the night he buried his family's ashes in the canyon. Ellie sat silently at the table, watching him. Not afraid, just resigned. Like she'd expected this ending all along. "You can leave," she said finally. "They want me, not you." James looked up. "I told you. You're safe here. No one ever is." Her voice was flat, but her eyes trembled. Beneath the steel, she was still a child, just one who had run out of places to hide. James loaded the rifle and stood it near the back door. He turned off the light, leaving only the fire's glow flickering on the walls. "Then we'll change that." The first real threat came 2 nights later. James heard the horses screaming before he saw the flames. He ran outside barefoot, shotgun in hand. A shadow darted from the barn, something metallic flashing in his grip. The eastern wall was ablaze, hay igniting like dry paper. He fired into the air. The figure disappeared into the trees. Ellie appeared at his side seconds later, boots half-laced, face pale in the firelight. "Get water," he shouted. She didn't hesitate. Together, they battled the blaze, smoke choking their lungs, eyes burning. Briggs barked from the porch, pacing and snarling at the tree-lean. By dawn, the fire was out. Half the barn gone. Sparrow singed but safe. James slumped against the corral post, shirt soaked in sweat, blood trickling from a shallow cut on his forearm. Ellie sat beside him, hands blistered, hair singed at the ends. For a moment, they said nothing. "They're not gonna stop," she said. "No," he agreed. "But neither will we." The sheriff came that afternoon, squinting at the blackened beams. "You think this was them?" he asked. James didn't answer. "You know, James, harboring a runaway, especially from that kind of operation, makes you a target. I can't always get here in time." "She's not a runaway," James said. "She's a survivor." The sheriff sighed. "You always had a soft spot for the broken ones. Maybe that's because I broke too." That night, James taught Ellie how to hold the rifle. Not to shoot, just to stand, to aim, to not tremble. He watched her grip it, feet planted firm, shoulders squared. "Like this?" she asked. "Exactly." They slept in shifts after that. One on the recliner, one on the couch. The fire never went out. On the fourth night, the silence was so deep it ached. Even the coyotes kept away. Briggs growled low from the front door, hackles raised. James sat up instantly, heart thudding. Then came the sound. Gravel crunching beneath slow, deliberate footsteps. James rose and grabbed the rifle. Ellie stood behind him, barefoot but steady. He opened the door a crack. 3 figures stood in the dark, 2 near the gate, 1 halfway up the porch steps. All in black. No insignias. No words. Just presence. The man on the steps held up a phone. On the screen, a photo. Ellie, bloodied and bound, face barely recognizable. James's blood turned to ice. "She's ours," the man said. "No," James replied. "She's not." The man smiled without warmth. "You don't know who you're messing with, old man." James raised the rifle. "Try me." For a breathless second, no one moved. Then Briggs launched through the door, teeth flashing. Chaos erupted. James fired once, grazing the leg of one attacker. Ellie ran for the barn. Another man followed, but Sparrow, wild-eyed, reared and screamed, blocking his path. James tackled the third, slamming the rifle but into his gut. They rolled in the dirt, fists flying, until headlights swept across the yard, sheriff's truck skidding to a stop, sirens piercing the stillness. The attackers scattered, vanishing into the night like wolves. James stood, panting, blood running from his temple. Ellie clutched Sparrow's mane, shaking but upright. Briggs limped back, growling, fur matted with blood that wasn't his. The sheriff jumped out, eyes wide. "You all right?" "No," James said, voice low. "But she is." Inside, Ellie sat at the table, staring at her hands. Her knuckles were bruised from gripping the pitchfork she'd used to fend off one of the men. James poured water into a chipped glass and handed it to her. She didn't drink, just held it. "I thought if I ran far enough, they wouldn't find me," she whispered. James sat across from her. "Running doesn't always mean you're scared. Sometimes it just means you're smart enough to survive." She looked at him then, really looked. And for the first time, her walls cracked. "You could have let them take me." He shook his head. "You saved me first." The fire crackled. Outside, the sheriff and his deputies scoured the property. But inside, the storm had already passed. Not the danger, no, that still lingered. But something deeper had shifted. A line had been drawn, and neither of them would ever step back from it. Ellie leaned back, eyes red but dry. "They'll come again." James nodded slowly. "And next time, we'll be ready." The world blurred sideways as James collapsed into the dirt, blood soaking through the denim at his side. Ellie was already running, boots skidding across gravel, a scream caught in her throat. The sheriff's deputies were still shouting behind her, flashlights cutting through the dark, but all she could hear was his breathing, shallow, ragged, fading. "Stay with me," she cried, dropping to her knees. Her hands pressed against the wound. "You're not leaving me too." James tried to speak but only managed a whisper. Her name. Not quite said, not quite finished. Just a sound pulled from whatever strength he had left. The ambulance arrived 10 minutes later. Ellie rode with him, fingers still slick with his blood, eyes refusing to close. He'd saved her life. Now it was her turn. For 2 days, she stayed in the hospital waiting room, curled in a stiff plastic chair with Sparrow's lead rope coiled in her lap. She wouldn't leave. Not when she'd already lost too much. Not when he was the only person who hadn't given up on her. The doctor finally came out on the 3rd morning. "He's awake," she said. "You can go in, but only for a minute." Ellie didn't hesitate. She slipped past the nurses, through the curtain, and into the room that smelled like antiseptic and too many endings. James was pale, thinner somehow, but alive. His eyes fluttered open and met hers. A weak smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You look worse than me," he said. She rolled her eyes, but her throat tightened. "You scared me. You didn't scare easy." "I do now." He patted the edge of the bed. She sat beside him, her hand finding his. "They're gone?" he asked. "For now. They're looking for the rest of them. Sheriff said we helped crack a ring that crossed 3 states. Said we did good." James nodded, eyes heavy. "You did good." A week later, they returned to the ranch. Half the barn was still blackened from the fire, boards warped and splintered. But Sparrow ran through the open pasture like nothing had happened, mane flying, hooves pounding freedom into the earth. James walked slower now, leaning on a cane the sheriff had whittled him as a joke. Ellie stayed close, helping him through the mud, though she never said it out loud. Inside the house, things had changed. The walls no longer felt like tombstones. The rooms breathed again. Ellie had cleared out the dust, replaced the broken curtains with fabric she found in town, mismatched but bright. The photo of Ben still hung by the kitchen, but now beside it was a new one, the 3 of them, taken by a deputy before they left the hospital. James standing stiff and proud. Ellie squinting in the sunlight, a rare smile curling at her mouth. And Briggs, tongue out, leaning into them both. On Sunday, James stood on the porch and watched Ellie saddle Sparrow. She was stronger now, her back straighter, hands steady, eyes clearer. She wore confidence like armor. It didn't erase what had happened, but it redefined it. "You're getting good at that," James said. Ellie tightened the cinch. "I was always good. I just never had anyone who noticed." He smiled. "I notice." She paused, fingers on the stirrup, then turned to him. "Can I stay?" The question hit him harder than he expected. After everything, she still thought it wasn't certain. "You already have," he said. She nodded once, then swung into the saddle. Sparrow trotted toward the hills, Ellie rising in rhythm, the wind catching strands of her hair and lifting them like wings. Later that afternoon, James drove them into town. Ellie sat beside him in jeans that actually fit and boots she'd picked out herself. The social worker was waiting on the courthouse steps, clipboard in hand. James didn't like courthouses. Too many memories of things he couldn't undo. But today was different. They signed the papers in silence. Guardian. Dependent. Signatures that tethered them together in a way deeper than law. Afterward, the judge asked Ellie if she understood what she was agreeing to. She looked at James, then back at the judge. "I'm not agreeing to stay because I have to," she said. "I'm staying because I belong." James didn't speak. Couldn't. His throat burned with something too big for words. Back at the ranch that evening, Ellie made dinner. Her soup wasn't perfect, but it filled the house with warmth. They ate together, side by side, the silence between them no longer heavy but peaceful. James stood and pulled down the last relic he hadn't been able to part with, a charred horseshoe from the fire, bent and blackened. He placed it in the hearth. "Time to let the past stay where it belongs," he said. Ellie nodded. "And build something new." Outside, the sky turned gold with the setting sun. They walked together to the small hill where James had buried his wife and son. Ellie knelt and placed a handful of wildflowers between the stones. "Thank you," she whispered. "For sharing him. For sharing you." James didn't reply. He simply put his arm around her shoulders and let the wind carry the silence. As they walked back down the hill, James turned to her. "You gave me something I didn't know I needed," he said. "What?" "A reason." She smiled, the kind that carried scars and hope in equal measure. And in the distance, the ranch, once a graveyard, now breathed like a heart learning to beat again.